For the first time in years, Sweden has finally done something that we didn't expect at Eurovision. Despite the presence of a former Eurovision winner in their selection this year, they've instead opted for 3 Finnish men singing about a sauna. Today, we're going to look back over Sweden's national selection Melodifestivalen and how a show designed to engineer cookie-cutter jury bait finally got its underdog story. We are also going to see how some people couldn't handle that and decided to make a fool of themselves in front of the press. As always, make sure to like the video, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and you can follow me and my editor Jay on social media. The links are in the description, as well as how to support us financially if you wish. Quickly before we start, today's video is sponsored by Surfshark. Luckily, the Swedish broadcaster makes it really easy to watch the national final if you're living abroad. Not every broadcaster is the same. As a result, I've had a lot of help from Surfshark to get around geo-blocks and watch these shows in peace. Surfshark has more than 3,200 servers in more than 100 countries, and they're high speed, so you're not going to have to deal with buffering either. If you're in the US, for example, you can use Surfshark to watch recent Eurovision shows on YouTube that otherwise would be blocked in the country. That means no more being forced to use Peacock instead. If you're planning on going to the contest in Basel this year in person, it could save you money as well. With Basel being so close to the French border, if you turn on Surfshark and set your location to France, it will get you better deals on train tickets in France. Surfshark will also notify you if you're the victim of a data breach, and it'll keep your web activity anonymous. They can also help remove your data from brokers who are buying and selling it to dodgy customers. Recently, I used this service myself, and since then, the silence on my phone and in my spam inbox has been blissful. That probably has something to do with the fact that Surfshark has removed me from 140 data brokers lists. Hopefully, it also means that Lundvik and Mon Zelmerlow won't be angrily knocking at my door by the end of this video. You can get an extra 4 months free of Surfshark by going to surfshark.com/ESCGabe. That's surfshark.com/ESCGabe. And the link is in the description, so make sure not to pass up on that opportunity. Now, let's talk about some of the songs that made up Melodifestivalen this year, starting from the first one in the show. First up was Jon Lundvik with his song, Voice of the Silent. Last year, I complained a lot about the high prevalence of vapid, meaningless pop in Melfest, with very little personality, typically centering around vague platitudes such as love or togetherness or world peace, but of course sanitized to the maximum possible extent. For that reason, it's very appropriate that this song opens the show, because we're starting this year in the same place. Jon Lundvik is perhaps best known among Eurovision fans for his less than amused reaction to not winning the contest in 2019. And this year, he actually managed to outsalt himself. He wasn't the only one, so we'll be handing out our Natalia Barbu Commemoration Awards for Sorest Loser later in the video, and we will come back to this point. The one thing that can be said for Jon Lundvik's song at Eurovision 2019 is that at least it worked as a package. And that was in no small part due to the fact that he was joined on stage by the Mamas. That was a really great combination. They helped elevate each other, and as a result, you had a performance full of joy and charisma. Given how underwhelmed I've been by Jon's solo efforts since then, I'm increasingly doubting whether he's capable of delivering the goods on stage by himself. That interaction between him and the Mamas gave that performance in Eurovision some real magic. And that's why it did so well. But without them there to support him, he just has none of that. There was nothing in this song to hold on to. No story was told on stage. There was no chemistry between multiple performers because he was up there by himself. There was no deep lyrics, and there was no interesting musical choices to make you pause for a moment. Instead, we got Nothing Burger Peace Ballad number 674. And with Thomas Gison and Jimmy Jansen on the songwriting team, that didn't feel like much of a surprise. I just don't understand what the point of this song is or who it's meant to appeal to, aside for a box-ticking exercise with juries. I don't think it helped either that the very first line of this song is "Take a breath and breathe."
Take a breath and breathe.
In terms of bad lyrics, this one is one of the picks of the bunch this year, and it sets the tone wrong right out of the gate. There is more to say about Jon's reaction to his result in this show, which was a mid-table finish. We will return to that once we've talked about the other songs. Luckily, the next one we have to talk about was much more fun. That was Dolly Style, with their song, Yee-Haw. Dolly Style is made up of Molly, Holly, Yolly, and Polly. Together, they brought us what was possibly the biggest fever dream of this year's Melodifestivalen. Luckily, it was also one of the most fun parts of the entire show as well. We can say right up front that this entire thing is ridiculous. It's a bunch of women in wigs, singing about riding a horse, yelling yee-haw, and waving whips around. It's silly, it's camp, it's totally unserious, and I absolutely love it. This burns straight into your brain and it stays there. I have spent the entire week never being more than 5 minutes away from hearing Yeehaw in the back of my mind somewhere. That, combined with the fact that this is a massive hit in Sweden now, suggests that Dolly Style probably achieved what they aimed to achieve from the competition. In addition to that, despite multiple previous attempts with different lineups, this is the first time that Dolly Style have ever been in a Melodifestivalen final. Not everything has to be deep and serious, and this was certainly neither of those things. But every national final should have at least some mindless, ridiculous fun, and this ticked that box for me. If I had it my way, we'd have this kind of silliness finishing 5th in Melfest every single year. Just high enough to make sure it keeps happening, just low enough that it doesn't actually run the risk of winning the show. Next up, we have Gresa with his song, Believe Me. This song is the first one to appear in the Melfest final to be written by a team of songwriters of which none of them have appeared in a Melfest final before since 2016. That's a decade without a single song with totally new songwriters. That's a damning indictment of how Melfest runs, but it also means that we got a quite refreshing sound from this. There's no prizes for seeing where the influence is drawn from, because it clearly references Bowie and Queen and that kind of glamorous rock and roll era of the 70s and 80s and 90s. This is a pretty straight down the line version of that, but at the same time there's a certain authenticity to it that makes me have a lot more time for it than I otherwise would. This stood out from the rest of the lineup on genre alone, and I really think there is something to be said for how authentic it feels. I have criticised Melodifestivalen and Eurovision national selections more generally for presenting pastiches and approximations of what a specific set of songwriters' idea of a genre is, rather than something that truly represents the kind of things that it's drawing from. This clears that hurdle, and as a result, it taps into a kind of nostalgia factor, kind of similar to what I felt about Spaceman at Eurovision 2022, combined with a really good live performance that involved Gresa being hoisted up into the air with his piano, and you had a package that I genuinely would have been quite happy to see at Eurovision. In the end, it wasn't to be on that front, and this was always going to be a two-horse race between the frontrunners. That said, I can't help but wonder how this would have fared had it made it to the contest. Outside of what actually won, this probably would have represented the most interesting proposition for the country at the contest this year. Moving swiftly on, we're going from a first-timer to a Melfest veteran in the form of Klara Hammarstrom. This time she came with her song On and On and On. Klara has been something of a favourite for Melodifestivalen fans for quite some time now. She's been in this competition a few times already and had a genuine chance at winning with songs like Run to the Hills. This year she came back with something that was very much along the same line as those previous attempts. To her credit, she is nothing if not reliable when it comes to this show. Every time she'll deliver a slick, well-manufactured pop banger that charts well, makes the final, and then gets a reasonable amount of points at the end of the evening. That said, something strange did happen this time, and as a result, we didn't quite see the best of her that we might have hoped for. In the semi-final, her performance was basically bang on, but in the final, there were things that were going off that made it seem like more was going on than her simply having a bad night. The first and most obvious difference is that her vocals were much, much breathier, and nowhere near as strong as they were in the semi-final. That alone isn't all that remarkable, because all artists have good days and bad days, or days where they wake up with a sore throat or whatever else. What really struck me is that in the semi-final, you can see that she's relaxed and focused and in the zone. In the final, she is clearly unsettled. She's not yet set in place when the announcer does her intro. And then once the song starts, you can see tension and stiffness in her head and neck. As well as that, she misses a mark or two for the changing camera shots in the first verse. This doesn't just feel like a slightly tired voice or a slightly nervous performance. As a result, when I watched this performance live, the first thing that came to mind was that she was either sick or that something had happened before her performance that had given her some level of stress or both. Given the masses of evidence that Klara is a great live performer, I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt and focus on the song rather than on that performance this time. That's because it's easy to see that this was a freak bad night for her, and 99% of the time, she would have done better than this. There were some things that I did like about this song. I found the opening quite captivating, and for me, we were going along the right lines through the first verse and into the pre-chorus. What I understand a little less is why you would build up all of this energy through that pre-chorus and then let it fall away again before the chorus comes in. What we ended up with certainly wasn't bad, and I enjoy listening to it, but it kind of feels like that you had a song of only verses and a song of only choruses that were then stitched together. Don't get me wrong, they still make it work, which is a testament to how good the production is. But there was just this slight incoherence that limited it for me. This did have the potential to be one of my favourites, if not my outright favourite of the selection, if it hadn't felt like that. Unfortunately, this just made it fall short. Unfortunately, it doesn't look too likely that Klara is going to come back to Melodifestivalen in the near future. That's a real shame because there is so much potential for her when it comes to the contest. She just needs the right song. Personally, my fingers are crossed that at some point in the future, she'll change her mind and return. We're going to move on to an act that was in the show last year and just missed out on the final. That was Scarlet, returning this time around with their song, Sweet and Psycho. Personally, I thought Scarlet were kind of screwed over last year, and a final place this year is the least they deserve. I won't get into the ridiculous second chance round system that meant that they never really had a chance of qualifying for the final by finishing outside of the top two in their heat. But suffice to say, it was a total mess, and I'm glad they changed it this year. This time around, they brought a bombastic pop song with rock and metal undertones, and the stage show did sell it well. At the same time, I do feel sorry for these dancers who appear to be being pulled up into the air by their, yeah, let's move on. Unfortunately, as much as this is attempting to appeal to people who like rock and metal, it doesn't really pass the smell test. There is a growing trend in Melfest for there to be a song or two each year with this kind of vibe. But what's underneath it is just as formulaic a pop song as everything else. This role was filled a couple of times by Smash Into Pieces, and they almost won the show. But Scarlet seem to be the ones carrying this forward now. This seems to be something of a new trademark for Swedish songwriters as well. You can look into other national finals and traces of a similar kind of thing start showing up. One notable example in this case is that the post-chorus of this song sounds really like the post-chorus of Se Quien Soy. That was in the Spanish national final last year. There's not really any way to explain this without actually playing them side by side, so I'll do that now. Sweet and Psycho. Se Quien Soy was written by Thomas Gison, who is very much in the same school of songwriters as the writers of Sweet and Psycho. I mentioned this pastiche of a genre problem earlier, and this unfortunately feels like the case here. There is precious little in the way of serious rock or metal at Melodifestivalen, and there's no need to limit the options to something as unadventurous as this. If they really want to push the envelope with heavier music, they can do that. And they have a great production, which means whatever they put forward, they'll be able to turn into a really great show. All I can wish for in the future is that, despite the fact I liked this song, we have something more authentic coming down the line. I would much rather have real rock and metal than the Melfest songwriting clique's idea of what metal and rock might be. Moving forward, we're now going to talk about Meira Omar. This was her Melfest debut, and she came with her song, Hush Hush. In Eurovision terms, this song kind of felt like it was both in the wrong country and the wrong decade. The reason for that is that its closest Eurovision relative is probably Azerbaijan's entry in 2009. In general, it traces its roots back to the kind of ethno-pop that was most prevalent in the late 2000s. What was happening back then was still to do with Swedish songwriters, where essentially you take a generic pop song, give it some kind of ethnic feel that could apply to a wide variety of different cultures, and then shop it around Europe until someone bites for it. That does mean that this song comes with a certain nostalgia factor, and for people like me who started watching the contest in that era, that does add to the enjoyment of it. I think that's partly why it has such a good reputation with Eurofans. This is a well-written song too. One thing that did strike me is that it seems to essentially perform itself. Meira is a really good dancer and she has really good stage presence, but it's much harder to gauge how good her vocals are based on this performance. All of the vocal lines are really straightforward, and she is buried in backing vocals. That basically makes it impossible for her to have a bad day. I don't say that to denigrate her, and there is some serious respect in coming to this stage when you're not a very experienced performer. She got her big break in the Swedish entertainment industry through the show Love is Blind. As a result, she's only been in the public eye for a couple of years, and she's barely dabbled in the music industry at all. All of this means that securing a top 5 hit in the country and making it to the final of the show is a really, really good first effort for her. In addition to that, it probably had one of the catchiest hooks of the year. That said, we do need to move on, and it's time to talk about the first of the 2 big favourites. That was returning Eurovision winner Mon Zelmerlow. 10 years after Heroes, he returned with his song Revolution.
People that will change the world. It's been a lifetime coming.
It's actually very apt to start with Heroes here, because this is a song that is very similar to Heroes, both in subject matter and in how it sounds. This is a well-formed pop song with a 2010s feel. Unfortunately for Mons, 10 years ago when he won Eurovision, it was the 2010s. Now it is not, and for that reason, this didn't hit the same way that Heroes did on the first listen. Luckily for him, he did still have some tricks up his sleeve. And these were tricks that, given how good his performance was when he won in 2015, anybody could have seen coming. He brought a live performance with bags of charisma, bags of stage presence, and a staging that was well thought out as well. One thing I would say is that this giant prop that he spends most of the performance inside of reminds me of, well, suffice to say, my Discord server has taken to calling it the Mons Sussy. That hopefully is enough information to see what I'm getting at here. In all seriousness, Mons was the favourite from the very first moment that he was announced as one of the participants. That said, there were some clear cracks starting to show from quite early on. The comparisons to another previous returning winner in Loreen were obvious ones to make. But while Tattoo dominated the Swedish charts and never really looked like it was going to concede its status as an inevitable winner, Revolution just wasn't able to do that. Sure, it was competing at the top of the charts, but by the time the final came around, it was losing out to Kai, who we're about to talk about, comfortably. And as well as that, Klara Hammarstrom and even Dolly Style were outstreaming him. This was a package that, on paper, ticked all the boxes. But that was almost part of the problem. It felt like a box-ticking exercise. That's not to doubt Mons' passion about this project, and not to doubt the fact that he did spend a lot of his own money to afford such a complex staging and to put together something that was really enjoyable to watch live. It just felt that Mons got caught up in a prevailing wind that wasn't entirely his fault. In retrospect, we probably should have known it would happen eventually. The conventional wisdom of Melfest would be that this song would walk its way to a victory, cleaning out with the juries and then winning with the public as well. That didn't happen, and the reaction of Mons and others speaks volumes. But in order to talk about those who lost and the institutions behind them, we have to talk about the biggest underdog in recent Melodifestivalen history. Certainly for as long as I've been watching it. That is Kai, who will be going to Eurovision with their song Bara Bara Bastu. This should not have been possible. This show is designed in a way to make something like this never get within even a sniff of winning. And yet, here we are. This was easily my favourite of the selection, and to be honest, I think it was the favourite of about 90% of Eurovision fans by the time the final rolled around. Evidently, it was also the favourite of the Swedish public, but we could not have started further from that. When this year's participants were announced, Kai started last in the odds, 30th out of 30. Naturally, that all changed when they performed their song in the heat. Ironically, they only finished second in that heat behind Mons, but shortly after they rocketed to #1 in the charts, and they haven't relinquished that ever since. They were still outsiders despite this come final night, based on the conventional wisdom that the international juries would never allow something like this to get within a shot of winning. This was where the biggest shock, in my opinion, of all arrived. Mons did win that jury vote, but only by 2 points. It always looked clear that Kai were going to win the televote, and the jury being that close meant that their 9-point margin there was enough to overturn Mons' lead and win the show overall. In the wake of the contest, it's emerged that not only was this song the most voted for song in the history of Melodifestivalen, but they have also smashed every single streaming record associated with the show. This is also the first Swedish entry in Swedish for a quarter of a century. What makes this especially funny is that Kai are from Finland. Their first language is Swedish, and they are from a region in Finland where that is the predominant language. What the side effect of this is, though, is that Finns are in love with it too. This is already #1 in the Finnish charts, and come May, it's pretty much a lock to receive 12 from the public and 12 from the Finnish juries as well. Over the years, Melfest has become known for and been criticised for, including by me in a dedicated video just 12 months ago, being samey, predictable, and even approaching dull. If this song winning sparks a new trend in the competition in terms of the kinds of music and the kind of artists that participate, those criticisms could genuinely be a thing of the past in a few years. That's because Bara Bara Bastu is anything but a cookie-cutter pop song. It's sung in Swedish rather than English, it's not performed by the same small group of Melodifestivalen stars that come back every year, and for the most part, it's clear of the small group of songwriters who control the contest. Anders Wrethov is a serial participant in Melodifestivalen, but it's important to stress that Kai wrote this song by themselves first, and Wrethov had an editorial role later in the process, rather than producing the song himself. At the same time, this does kind of have a best of both worlds feeling. Yes, it's different, and yes, it's humorous and enjoyable and fun in a very different way to any other Melfest entry for some years now, but it does still retain the polished production and the slick and well-executed finish that Sweden is known for. That makes it the perfect blend, not just to appeal to Swedes and their sense of fun, but also their sense of what they want to send to Eurovision too. It may have been Mon Zelmerlow singing about a revolution, but it was Kai who delivered one. Unfortunately, neither Måns nor John Lundvik took it particularly well, and we do need to talk about their responses to this result, as well as what it says about the Swedish music industry at large. Ahead of the show, Måns, in my opinion, got his PR strategy completely right. He deliberately put across a humble persona, played down his chances, predicted that Kai would win, and said he was just there for the love of the game. He insisted that he just loved Melodifestivalen and he loved being part of the show, and that was his motivation for participating again. If you're the favourite and you want to alleviate some pressure and just manage expectations a little bit, this is exactly the right path to take. Unfortunately, this PR masterclass gave way to something slightly less savoury after the show had concluded. Måns gave a series of interviews, but one quote has stuck in the imagination more than any other. "I was shocked that the juries gave Kai such high scores. I sound like a bad loser, but we will see in May if the international juries made the right choice." He's right to identify, firstly, that this makes him sound like a sore loser. But when you've built your entire narrative through the competition on being humble and just being happy to participate, it makes everything you did up to that point feel insincere. In his defense, at least he didn't have as big a meltdown as John Lundvik, who claimed that Melodifestivalen had become TikTokified, that he wouldn't try to go to the show again, and that he'd like to try and go to Eurovision for a different country. We'll see him in San Marino next year, I guess. The only reason he hasn't had the same level of scrutiny that Måns has had is that, in the eyes of everyone except himself, he was a minor footnote in this competition at best. The kind of artist who would love to return to this show having already won it is going to be somebody who loves competition, and Måns definitely fits that mold. Nobody is going to doubt that he clearly absolutely loves Mello and he loves Eurovision. There's also some validity in what he's been saying about having to face down a lot of abuse and unpleasant behaviour from a small section of fans over the last few weeks. He's even shared some of that on his Instagram story. Because of all that, I think there are definite mitigating factors to how he reacted after the show. While it's certainly not the most professional thing to do, I'm willing to say that we can put it down to the unique pressures of the environment, which inevitably took a toll on his mental health. That said, if I was him, I wouldn't have started his post-show reaction post with the words, "Dear bigoted haters." At the same time, both his and John Lundvik's reactions speak volumes about the Swedish music industry more broadly and how it views this competition. In both John and Måns' responses, there was an element of genuine confusion, as if to say, we've ticked every box, we've got the polished song, the staging, the live performance. Why are we not getting the rewards that we deserve? This is the exact paint-by-numbers mentality that has frustrated me about Sweden in the contest for years. And it's the exact mentality that needs to be avoided if this show is going to stay one of the most well-regarded and most prestigious in Europe. I don't think I'm the only one to think this, and I think, to be honest, compared to some pundits, I'm going pretty easy on them here. One columnist in the Swedish news outlet Aftonbladet put it rather more bluntly, leading with the line, "How many chances should the boring guys get?" and twisting the knife further by saying several of the artists also had their own theories about why things didn't go better for them. The fact that their contributions were boring, predictable, and devoid of emotion was strangely not part of that explanation. She then delivered a knockout blow with, "I think it's very kind of SVT to let them be involved at all. Maybe it's time for the guys to show some gratitude instead of whining. Without Melodifestivalen, no Swede would have even known that they make their quote-unquote high-quality music." I wouldn't necessarily be that harsh. But at the same time, with Melodifestivalen being basically unbeatable in terms of production and only matched in national importance and cultural significance by San Remo in Italy, there is so much more scope to take risks, and it's not necessary to keep things so cookie-cutter and so straight down the line. You can take risks and do something interesting and use that massive amount of institutional knowledge and that excellent production to make sure that it works on stage as well. Bara Bara Bastu is a perfect example of that, and there's no reason why there can't be 6 or 8 or 10 songs like this next year, in all kinds of different genres and different styles. Nobody is saying that there shouldn't be solid, polished pop, and this competition wouldn't be the same without it. But you can have that and have a sharp edge that will really elevate the show even further. There's only one real way for Sweden to learn this lesson though, and that's if Kai are awarded in May with a really great result. Luckily, I do think that's going to be the case, because at the time of writing, this is still #1 in the odds to win the whole contest. Admittedly, it has longer odds than we'd usually see for the favourite at this point in the cycle. But because this is going to go very big with the public, and we've already seen that it can appeal to juries at Melodifestivalen, we can't rule out a televote victory and a good enough jury result to deliver an 8th win for Sweden this year. I would personally be very happy for Sweden to take the whole thing, although I doubt my wallet would be, as we'd then be on for a third contest in an expensive country beginning with the letters SW in 3 years. In all seriousness, it's genuinely refreshing for me to feel like I can root for Sweden at Eurovision in a way that I probably haven't done for most of my time watching the competition, with the possible exception of Cornelia Jacobs. We'll know what happens to Kai at Eurovision soon, but in the meantime, make sure to like this video if you enjoy it, and make sure to subscribe to the channel as well. We have lots still planned to come for the rest of Eurovision season, and I can't wait to see you there. For now, take care, and I'll see you again in 7 days' time.